Welcome back, Focus Learners. Today, we are unpacking a really fascinating and honestly highly counterintuitive explainer. We're going to be looking at this complex relationship between air pollution, global temperatures, and the philosophical approach we take towards scientific consensus. It's a pretty compelling argument from our source material about how well-intentioned environmental policies might actually produce some completely unexpected consequences. So let's jump right in.
Okay, let's dive into this. A recent study published in the Geophysical Research Letters asks a really surprising question. Why is Europe specifically experiencing such intense heat? Now, the intuitive guess for most of us is that we just aren't doing enough to curb pollution, right? But the study reveals a completely mind-boggling answer. It's actually not the pollution causing this localized spike. It's the lack of it.
80%. That is a central figure to this whole argument. You see, over the last 30 years, Europe successfully cut its sulfate emissions by roughly 80%. They did this through stringent acid rain rules, low sulfur fuel standards, and mandating scrubbers on smokestacks. Sounds great for the air, right? Well, the study's authors told The Telegraph that as a direct result of cleaning the air since 1980, Europe has unexpectedly warmed about 1 degree more than the rest of the Northern Hemisphere, and 1.5 degrees more than the global average.
And this brilliantly illustrates a massive paradox. More sulfur historically meant a cooler Earth, because that pollution effectively acted like a giant shield, reflecting sunlight away from the surface. Consequently, less sulfur means a hotter Earth, because you're removing that reflective shield. It really begs a difficult question. How do authorities enforce sweeping, costly mandates to clean the air if those exact measures inadvertently accelerate local warming? To really grasp this, let's look at Benjamin Franklin's 1784 discovery. So, to understand the physics here, we have to rewind all the way back to 1783. A massive volcanic fissure in Iceland had spewed toxic gas that drifted all across Europe as a sort of dry fog. For 8 months, it vented the largest lava flow seen in 1,000 years, just devastating crops and livestock. The following summer, Benjamin Franklin was in Paris, and he noticed that the sun looked, well, wrong. Using literally nothing but a magnifying glass, he tried to focus a sunbeam onto a scrap of brown paper. But the light was so incredibly weak, it wouldn't even catch fire. Think about that for a second. Contrast that with today's landscape of satellites and supercomputers. Franklin figured out the complex atmospheric physics of aerosols blocking sunlight using just a piece of glass in Paris. By December of 1784, Franklin wrote a paper concluding that the sulfurous haze was blocking the sunlight, which had caused the ground to freeze early and created a brutal winter. But notice the title he chose for his paper: Meteorological Imaginations and Conjectures. He had successfully deduced that sulfur in the air cools the ground, yet he possessed the humility to frame his groundbreaking findings as a mere guess. He freely admitted he could be wrong.
Let's move to and see how this builds into a timeline of predictions. Our source contrasts that historical humility pretty sharply with a modern timeline of high-profile climate predictions that were presented as absolute certainties. Check this out. In 1971, NASA scientists claimed that quadrupling aerosols would drop temperatures by 3.5 degrees, triggering an ice age. By 1975, Newsweek ran a huge cover story on the cooling world. Fast forward to 2000, a climate researcher claimed children wouldn't even know what snow was anymore. In 2004, a Pentagon report warned Britain would have a Siberian climate by 2020. In 2007, the IPCC stated Himalayan glaciers would vanish by 2035. And in 2009, Al Gore predicted a 75% chance the North Pole would be completely ice-free within 5 to 7 years. The underlying argument here is that the establishment is consistently wrong on these specific timelines, yet rarely scales back its tone of absolute certainty.
Just take those 1975 predictions of a cooling world, for example. Back then, the warnings claimed global food production was basically about to collapse, and that wheat belts across Canada and the Soviet Union would completely vanish within 10 years. But instead, world grain production more than doubled in that exact decade. Today, to put that into perspective, the UN's Food Agency records a global cereal harvest of nearly 3 billion tons, 2.96 billion tons to be exact. The wheel of alarming predictions keeps turning, yet the failed track record often just goes unnoticed.
This brings us to what's essentially the 2020 shipping experiment. We are seeing a modern regulatory change right now that perfectly mirrors that European sulfate reduction we talked about earlier, but on a planetary scale. Step 1, the International Maritime Organization instituted a rule cutting the allowable sulfur in ship fuel from 3.5% down to just 0.5%. Step 2, as a direct result, sulfur dioxide emissions from global shipping plummeted by 80%, essentially overnight. And step 3, The unintended consequence? Researchers now estimate that removing the sulfur pollution could potentially double the warming rate of this current decade compared to the rate since 1980. It was basically an unvoted-on planetary experiment conducted on the entire ocean without any real public debate.
Now, what's really interesting here is how researchers in 2024, writing in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment, officially labeled this sudden drop in cooling pollution. They called it an inadvertent geoengineering termination shock. That is a massive complication to our current climate strategies. It highlights the wild irony that taking pollution out of the air might actually accelerate the exact warming authorities are desperately trying to prevent. Now let's briefly look at combating media bias. Because these narratives are incredibly complex and often contradict mainstream reports, our source material advocates for using tools that help users see multiple viewpoints, like the FreeSpoke search engine. As outlined by the source, FreeSpoke is designed to bypass algorithmic bias by actively comparing how left, right, and independent sources cover the exact same story. It does this without tracking your searches or building user profiles. It's presented as a tool to help you draw your own conclusions rather than just relying on a single filtered narrative. Which brings us to our final theme, arrogance versus humility. So, the crucial point the source is making here isn't necessarily that scientific data is some big scandal, but rather it's a critique of institutional attitudes. On one side, you have Benjamin Franklin in 1784, explicitly embracing the possibility that his conjectures could be completely wrong. On the other side is the modern demand that the science is settled, which is often attached to sweeping mandates, new taxes, or major lifestyle changes. It highlights what the source views as a loss of the ability to admit to estimates and a tendency to label any dissent as misinformation, even when air cleaning policies inadvertently cause regional heating.
Which leaves us with a really vital question to reflect on. As we navigate an incredibly complex environment where well-intentioned policies, like scrubbing sulfur from the air, can yield sudden, paradoxical temperature shocks, how should society proceed? What is the right balance between the scientific certainty required to make policy and the historical humility required to admit we might not fully understand the consequences? It's absolutely something to think about the next time you hear a claim about settled science. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you in the next explainer.